As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Recording once again, live and direct from Dakar, Senegal, from a very hot Dakar and Senegal at the moment. I am super excited to be in conversation today with Florian, someone I've met on my journey, on my travels whilst being in Senegal, who focuses on liberation struggles and state violence in 1960s and 1970s Senegal. I'm super excited to be talking about Omar Blondin Diop, someone whose name keeps on coming up in the work that I'm trying to do. Welcome to the Malcolm Effect, Florian. How's it going?
I'm all right. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure and honor. So today I want to speak about Omar Blondin Diop. So first and foremost, my question to you is, how did you come across Omar Blondin?
Yeah, that's a story in itself. So I've been on this research path journey for the past 5 years now. Mm-hmm. And it all started for me in 2018. Yep. So it was the 50th anniversary of May 68 around the world. And, there's a lot circulating about figures from May 68 and particularly an article on May 11th, 2018. So it was for the 45th anniversary of Omar Blondin Diop's death. So I entered this journey onto his death, because that's what's most well known about him, as he died in prison, right? Yeah. And I was interested in African history. That was my studies. I had spent my teenage years in Dakar already. And so all of that came together
at one time.
And I figured, well, why not research this man's life? And I realized how rich it was,
Exactly. So tell me a bit about his life. And I understand his life is so illustrious that no one episode can ever fully encapsulate his life. But tell me a bit about Omar Blondin.
Yeah, so roughly he's a philosopher, young philosopher, artist and activist. I think those three aspects define him rather well. Originally from Senegal, but also having family in Mali. And born in Niger. So he's got a Pan-African pedigree from the start. He was an active member of the May 68 movement in France. Then he was expelled from France, immersed himself in the underground radical left in Senegal under Senghor's presidency. And then he undertook a struggle for military training in Syria.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's probably going to be a whole other story, but that military training ultimately led to his arrest. And from that arrest, he was sent to jail and found dead in prison. In 1973.
I mean, we'll definitely speak about the kind of circumstances that led up to his death and his arrest. But speaking about 1968 and his involvement in France, Paris, what took him to Paris? What was he doing there? And how did he get involved?
So Senegal has a very long colonial history with France. And, the first French settlements date back from the 1600s.
Wow.
So come mid-20th century, there's over, 3 centuries of French presence. So the interactions and the circulations between Senegalese from Senegal to France, vice versa, were very frequent at the time. So what happened is that Omar Blondin Diop's father was a doctor. And he wanted to pursue his studies or to complete his studies with a PhD in France just after independence. So at that time, he moved to France with his family. And so Blondin Diop, who had spent his childhood in between Niger and Senegal, then, as a young teenager, moved to France. And so that's the context after having spent almost 10 years in France that May 68 arose, and he was in between both worlds, between West Africa and France.
So that leads me on nicely to then what led him to his own radicalization? Like, why did he deem it necessary to be involved in 1968 uprisings? Like, what radicalized Omar Blondin Diop?
Well, there's several stages, but for sure, the mid 1960s is really important starting point, at least like in the European left, right? with the whole debates around the USSR, the New Left as well from the States, the Cultural Revolution in China in 1966. And so student mobilization is, powering through in 1966, 1967. You've got lots of different branches that stem from, the communist students, but then you've got some who are pro-Soviet Union, others who are pro-Italy, others who are pro-China's Mao, or Mao's China rather. And so that's like a, very intense moment of politicization. And May 1968 arose not out of nowhere, because there was the consequences of the Algerian War for Independence, which were still very present in 1960 France. There was conservative society that felt like it had a stronghold over the youth, and De Gaulle's regime that was nearing its 10-year anniversary. And one thing, event led to another. There was the Nanterre movement of 22nd March movement, which Blondin Diop was part of. And all of these connections led to the explosion of early May 1968 and throughout that month.
So basically, Paris, France were like a melting pot of radicality in which all these different factions and groups were kind of converging in one space, dealing with issues of colonialism and what does decolonization mean for those who were ex-colonized or previously colonized peoples. And that's what you say. Would you say Omar Blondin finds himself in that kind of milieu then?
He finds himself in that, but what's interesting with him is that on one hand you have African activists who are disillusioned by the independence movements, and they find themselves in France in a union called La Fédération des étudiants africains en France, so that's the Federation of African Students in France. And so that's what you're talking about. And then on the other side you have French students, right? And Blondin's in between both. He's as much in radical left movements. So there's Maoism circulating, there's anarchism circulating, there's situationism. And also he's looking towards, African liberation struggles through this federation and also a Senegalese federation that's associated to it. And so he's at the crossroads between both.
So specifically on his, care for Africa or his politics towards Africa, how would you categorize that politics? What was his political orientation when it came to thinking about struggles within Africa and the African context?
So he was already very aware of what was happening back in Senegal and on the African continent. He was at the time very much in between Paris and London, right? So he had met South African liberation freedom fighters in London. And I'd say his politics were very much of the time, Pan-Africanism, obviously, anti-imperialism, which both go hand in hand, and also a radical critique of, the feudal system, especially in the Senegalese context, but that can also be understood in a larger context. But I'd say that his radicalization regarding the African context comes a little later. More in 1969. Because at that time, after having spent a year post-May 1968, he's expelled from France. And so that's also, I'd say, one of a key moment in his radicalization, because the country that he had been in for almost 10 years, and he had been in between France and Senegal, was now expelling him, right?
Wow.
And so at that time, it's also a moment of realization for him that he didn't know his country as well as he would have wanted to. And now he was forced to go back. So he sees that opportunity to also immerse himself in the radical left here. And so from that standpoint, it was still Pan-Africanism, still anti-imperialism, but also trying to both adapt and make an organic political perspective within the Senegalese context, which was not an easy thing, given that Senegal was still very much a powerful neo-colony, right? France's stronghold over Senegal in the 60s was enormous. The university was totally French. The economy was still largely controlled by French corporations. The CFA franc, which is still in action today, was very much as well at the time. So, Senegal was probably one of the most prominent French neo-colonies in the 60s. And so there was that whole movement that he tended towards here coming back.
So speaking about, I think it's very important to say his age at this point. How old was he when he came back to Senegal?
He was 23.
And I think that's important because when we're speaking about radicals, we forget, maybe not always, but we are perhaps led to believe that maybe they're older in age. But I think someone like Blondin, you know, he was a student, he was young, and he has such a past of organizing, and then comes back at the age of 23 to Senegal. So paint me the picture of what he comes back to in Senegal briefly. I know Senghor's in power. What's happening?
Yeah, so Senghor's in power. So Senghor, you know, hailed as the great poet humanist.
Honestly, everyone who listens to this podcast or sees my posts on social media will know how much smoke I have for Leopold Senghor. I cannot stand him. But anyway, sorry, I digress.
Right. So, well, that's a picture of him. I think that says enough. But yeah, so as I was saying, you know, Senegal was most likely, with Ivory Coast, you know, the most prominent neo-colony France had still a stronghold over. So it was a context of crisis. At the time, you know, agriculture was not going well at all. Right now, in the summer of 2023, we're not seeing much rain. And at the time, it was years and years of drought.
Wow.
So yeah, the countryside was really devastated by that, and workers in the countryside were really struggling at that point. You had 68, a year previous to Blondin's return, which, you know, had also been very active at the Dakar University here. And just generally a disillusionment toward independence. You know, Mali's president had been deposed shortly, you know, a year before in 68. Kwame Nkrumah was also deposed a few years previous. And so it was this sentiment that the Pan-Africanist ideal was slowly turning on its head. And more conservative, more reactionary governments were really imposing themselves on the long run. So that's the general context that Blondin set himself in. In terms of national politics, Senghor's rule was a one-party rule. And so opposition parties, student organizations, trade unions were all dissolved and just blatantly illegal.
Wow.
And so...
The great humanist.
Right. And so political mobilization was only possible on the ground. Clandestine movements. So that's the context he set himself in. There was a growing Maoist movement here. So he had drawn from Maoism, which also recalls his participation in Godard's La Chinoise movie in 67. But that's probably a side conversation. But yeah, Blondin was both into Maoism, but very quickly realized some of the smoke that it had as well, and could not fathom with the idea that anyone could just recite quotes and that would be their political philosophy, right? And let's say that that's the form that it took here among some of the Maoists. But he was also interested in situationism, anarchism, all that. And so he inserted himself in the radical left, contributed to the creation of the Senegalese Marxist-Leninist Youth, which was an underground political movement, which then several years later led to a rather widespread Maoist movement.
Oh, wow.
And he was in and out of political formal activism. He was also very much interested in the junction between politics and art, you know. So he spent a lot of time with, you know, radical artists, painters, musicians. And what he'd do is he'd bind both, right? So he'd go to the university to lectures, and he would have one of his friends who played saxophone. And so at the end or in the middle of a lecture, he'd just start, you know, screaming and saying, you know, get away from these bourgeois structures. You know, the education that your parents have given you is totally backward. And, you know, let's just free ourselves from all of this, all of these chains, right? And at that point, his saxophonist friend would play the saxophone, and like half of the audience would leave with them.
Amazing.
And leave the lecture hall. So
amazing. So clearly he has a deep appreciation for the arts. So talk about La Chinoise. Listeners, that is a film I really like. Talk to me about it. How did he end up in La Chinoise?
Yeah, so if we go back a few years now, in 66, 67, Blondin is very much integrated in the Parisian intellectual scene, artistic scene, and he's very much appreciated. You know, he's one of the only, if not the only, Black intellectuals at that point. And he meets through one of his common friends. His best friend at the time was Antoine Gallimard, who is the grandson of the founder of the Édition Gallimard, which is one of the biggest publishing houses in France. So through him, he met a lot of philosophers, writers, intellectuals, and he introduced him to the spouse of Jean-Luc Godard.
Okay.
Right? So it's through those connections that he met Jean-Luc Godard. And Jean-Luc Godard, so Swiss filmmaker, was looking for a Marxist-Leninist student.
Yeah.
Met with Blondin and figured, all right, he has to be in my movie.
Wow.
So that's how it happened. And in the end, the scene he plays in is very interesting because he talks about the European left, and he also describes it as such. It's essentially the third world, term used at the time, giving lecture to the European left and to the white left.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting dimension to that. And a year later, after La Chinoise, he went to London in the summer of '68 and joined Godard on the set of his movie 1+1, also renamed a little later Sympathy for the Devil, which is a junction between scenes of the Rolling Stones recording their album and members of the British Black Panther movement in a trench yard, reading radical texts from Amiri Baraka and Eldridge Cleaver.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he was on the set as a Black Power consultant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's quite impressive given his age as well. Okay, so speaking back to his time in Senegal, what did his own activism in Senegal look like? What were his activities? What specific changes did he want to see in Senegal? And then following that, how was he received by the Senegalese government?
Yeah. Well, he wasn't received very well by the Senegalese government.
I can imagine.
That's for sure. Yeah, his activism and his activities really were in between formalized political activism and just rekindling with his home country in very daily and popular ways. So the more formal activism, which he quickly branched away from, he was actually expelled from the party that he helped, the movement he helped co-found, because he was deemed by the less, let's say, adventurous wing of that movement as deviant and
too radical or
uncontrollable and not aligned enough on the party
line.
Right. That's pretty classic.
Yeah.
And so he was in between that. So going to, underground meetings at 3 a.m. in popular neighborhoods, and then getting the word that the next week there's another meeting at another time so that they don't get caught. So that's one aspect of it. As I was mentioning earlier, he also frequented a lot of artists, the underground, artist movement critiquing Senghor's negritude, which had become at that time like a state policy, right?
Wow.
So like there's one official art and you can't deviate from that.
Yeah.
So you had underground artists who were contesting that as well.
Wow.
And also just day to day, he had a part-time job as a researcher at the university. But what he'd do is he'd walk around for hours on end during the day in popular neighborhoods. So if anyone listening knows a little bit of Dakar, Koloban, Fas, Castor, Guédiouaï, Pikine. So all of these popular neighborhoods, where you would see the level of precarity in Senegalese society, and also the level of the wealth gap between, very rich neighborhoods where you had members of the regime, very rich business people, and on the other side, the vast majority of Senegalese masses struggling to make it just to survive one day. So that was, his various activities. And part of all of that, in between, meeting people on a daily basis in popular neighborhoods, in between formal political activism and his links with art, there's always, from his standpoint, a connection to international radical politics. And for one of the summers that he spent here, he spent weeks hosting Black American activists.
Wow.
And they would talk about the Black Panther Party. They would talk about the Vietnam War. They would talk about the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And so you have all these links happening in Dakar.
That's so super interesting, considering oftentimes, again, as said on this podcast, unfortunately, when we think about our contemporary age between, let's say, a newer generation of people who are concerned with the struggle for Black liberation, all too often the connections between the continent and the international sphere are not known. So my uncle said previously on this podcast, he was very much aware of what's happening in the US, and you're saying as well that US activists came to Senegal. So this kind of notion of like Africa ever being separate from the wider struggle and vice versa isn't accurate at all.
No.
And notions of like reverse diaspora come into play here as well,
No.
which I think is very important. I feel like these stories should often be spoken about and told. And I think it's very important that we do this work. So I remember when we first met, we spoke about, if I remember correctly, there was an attack on the French Cultural Center.
No.
Was Blondin involved in that? Or
So he was not directly involved.
Okay.
But let's say that the seeds he sowed bloomed. Right?
Okay.
Because that year after being expelled from France, he was very active, but he was also very active alongside his younger brothers. And it's his younger brothers that led the attack.
Oh, wow.
So what happened is that there was, for months and months, a conversation between Senghor, Senegalese head of state, and Pompidou, Georges Pompidou, the French head of state. Both of them were classmates in the late 1920s, right? So not only were they very closely tied by the historical links between Senegal and France, but they were also personally tied.
Yeah.
So Senghor advocated for Blondin's return to France, not because, he was necessarily preoccupied by Blondin's future, but more because he didn't want him as,
troublemaker.
Right, as a menace to his own regime.
Wow.
So finally he got the entry ban removed, and Blondin was allowed to go back into France in the fall of 1970.
Okay.
A few months later, that's when the attack occurs.
Oh, okay.
So Pompidou, French president, is set to visit Dakar.
Yeah.
And for about a year, Dakar, the main stretches and the main roads and avenues of Dakar are in construction, or rather in rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Only for like a 24, 48-hour visit. While all the popular neighborhoods, all the slums were obviously completely invisibilized, but also what Senghor would do quite often before these grand international meetings is they'd have what they call campagne de déguerpissement. So that means they'd whole stretches of tens of people or hundreds of people, notably, street vendors, they would take them and forcibly remove them from that area and send them like 10, 15 kilometers away so that, international partners, quote unquote, wouldn't see them as they come from the airport. So that was the plan for Pompidou's visit. A few weeks before the visit, a group of about 15 young radical activists inspired by the Black Panther Party and more generally Black Power in the States, and as well the Uruguayan movement of the Tupamaros, set fire to the French Cultural Center as a symbol of neo-colonialism.
Amazing.
And also an annex of the Ministry of Public Work, of Infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ministry of Infrastructure. And they weren't caught at the time, but they wanted to take it a step further. And the day of the visit, wanted to attack the motorcade.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. So not necessarily kill, but at least
cause some commotion.
Cause disorder.
Yeah.
After the fact, having spoken to a few of those who were part of the attack, they said it was unconscious because police probably would have just killed
anyone on site, obviously, shoot on site.
But anyway, that was what happened. So they got caught, and among the members that got caught were two of Blondin's brothers.
Wow.
And so at that time, Blondin, and that's the second moment of radicalization after him being expelled, he tried to see what was possible in terms of political or diplomatic exchanges to somehow find a resolution and get his comrades out of prison. So he met with Samir Armin in Paris. He met with Aimé Césaire in Paris, trying to have them as like advocates towards Senghor.
Wow.
Right? And to no avail. Samir Armin suggested that they build the political means for their action. And Aimé Césaire said that he couldn't, especially publicly, disavow his brother
Senghor.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so he'd send him a message personally and try to mediate, right? So after realizing that the more moderate ways of advocating for the comrades' release was to no avail, that's when they said, all right, we'll just do it ourselves.
Wow.
And that meant finding a way of getting military trained and releasing the comrades themselves. And so that led them through a few contacts within the Palestinian Liberation Movement to Syria.
Okay.
So they went to Syria in a training camp of the Fatah, where they met Palestinian freedom fighters and Eritrean freedom fighters as well. And so they military trained. They were in the desert, a few kilometers from Damascus. And so after a few months training, they headed to Algeria.
Wow.
Where you had the international chapter of the Black Panther Party, led at the time by Aldrich Cleaver.
Yeah.
And so what Blondin and a few of his comrades wanted was, through the mediation of Cleaver and the Black Panther Party, to have access to the National Liberation Front of Algeria, the party in power who had led the independence fight.
Yeah.
And that they could use their diplomatic tools to convince the Senegalese government to release their comrades. That didn't happen because at the time, the Black Panther Party was, entrenched in a crisis between Hugh Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, and it was just, they didn't have time to
get involved.
And so then they headed to Conakry, led by Sékou Touré.
Yeah.
And the name they gave at the airport was an uncle of Blondin.
Okay.
However, that uncle a few days prior had been deposed, or at least had been expelled from the government because Sékou Touré deemed him to be like an interior menace and part of international conspiracy to depose him from power.
Okay.
So he was not allowed to enter Guinean territory.
Blondin?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Then, after a few days in the Conakry airport, he was sent. He was able to flee to Bamako.
Okay.
In Mali. So he spent about 6 months. At the time, it was the military regime under Moussa Traoré.
Yeah.
He organized with Malian comrades, bearing in mind that he also had family in Mali.
Yeah, exactly.
And he at some point tried to get some weapons in Liberia. So he went through Ivory Coast and then Liberia. In the end, that plan didn't work out. But anyway, he was super active at that point, trying to find a plan to liberate his comrades, to free his comrades. Ultimately, the plan was to abduct the French ambassador to Senegal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
As the kind of like a hostage exchange program.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But it never came to fruition.
No, it never came to fruition because the Malian military regime had eyes everywhere. And before a Senghor visit to Mali, they caught Blondin. And the rest, I guess, is history.
So talk to me. He got caught in Mali then?
He got caught in Mali.
By the Malian government?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, who's the president of Mali at the time?
It was Moussa Traoré.
Moussa Traoré, exactly. So he's caught and then given to Senegalese government. Yeah.
So he spent almost 3 months in jails in Bamako.
Wow.
In atrocious conditions, you know, obviously no air conditioning.
Yeah.
Barely any walks outside of his cell. The Malian police used a razor and completely shredded his hair. So it was really very harsh conditions. And then he was extradited to Senegal a few months later.
Okay. Tried
and convicted for, these usual cases. I think it was
espionage, treason, or
it was being a threat to national security.
Oh, okay.
And, all that stuff. So he was convicted to 3 years. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison.
Okay.
Yeah. And sent to the infamous island of Gorée.
Gorée Island. I mean, the symbolism is it's incredible that he is sent to a place where slaves were sent from. And people who were involved in that slave trade were often the Europeans as well. Yeah. But carry on. So he's sent there and then
he spends a little over a year.
Yeah.
Very harsh conditions. He has about 1 hour of daylight a day.
And how old is he at this point?
He is 25.
Okay.
Yeah. And he has access to a few books, a few newspapers. But it's very, very difficult for him because he's a social being, right? Yeah. He needs to be interacting with people. He needs to be moving around.
Yeah.
He's always been in movement.
Yeah.
And so for him, it gets very complicated. We actually found a letter he wrote to the penitentiary administration.
Yeah.
Where he says that, the conditions are actually against Senegalese legislation and that he demands his detention conditions to be revoked. And he gets some visits, but progressively the situation gets a lot more tense with the prison guards who are absolutely ruthless.
Yeah.
And it's worth mentioning that at that time, the interior minister is a former French colonial officer.
The interior minister in Senegal is a former French colonial
officer. Yeah. Yeah. So throughout the 70s, you have a Frenchman, part of the colonial administration in the 40s and 50s, who stayed in Senegal, gained Senegalese citizenship at independence, married Senghor's niece, and became interior minister in the 70s.
Wow. And
so he gave very strict orders. It was be ruthless with these prisoners. Because these Blondin affiliates will try to mess with your head, and they'd even be able to stab you in the back as you're not looking at them. That was the whole rhetoric of the time.
Wow. And
eventually, you got fights between Blondin and the prison guards, and this interior minister, who's called Jean Colin, visits the prison in late April.
Yeah.
There's a clash between Blondin and him.
Wow.
And what most likely happened is that Blondin was beaten very harshly. And over the next few weeks, his state declined and progressively succumbed to his injuries, and then was found dead in his prison cell. And then the death was covered up as a supposed suicide.
Wow, that's the official story, but no one really buys it anyway.
No.
Wow. Well, no, thank you for that introduction to Blondin, and I hope that has inspired the listeners as it has inspired me and inculcated me with a love of Blondin and further re-entrenched my hatred of Senghor. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Thank you.
Till next time.
Thanks.